Good evening, and welcome to Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 29th, the last of the Fireside Chats for this year. There's a statement that Senate candidate Diane Sare issued today, and I'll read the statement. I'd like to put it in the context of the past month without going through the details of it. Vladimir Putin of Russia has not only increased or called for a mobilization of for a 50% increase in the armed forces of the nation of Russia. He also gave between 12 and 15 major speeches in the last approximately 2 weeks to various sectors of that government. He also spoke to heads of state around the world and others who have made statements, which we're not going to go through here now because we have businesses to deal with here tonight. But others who made statements from Russia have made it very clear that an era of history has closed and another has opened. That era between 1991 and 2021 is over. Something else is now afoot in the world, and whether or not that bodes well for the world or disaster for the world is really up to us. And we want to say a couple of things about upcoming events. The first of which is going to be occurring on Sunday, January 8th, from 2 to 4 p.m. And her statement is directed at that event. So it's called "Can Nuclear War Be Avoided?" And what I'm going to do is read the first two paragraphs of that statement. And she says, the answer to that question is yes, but only if the United States becomes a trustworthy partner. It is for that reason that my campaign is hosting an urgent policy discussion on Sunday, January 8th from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I have asked experienced retired military figures like Colonel Richard Black and Scott Ritter, as well as nuclear weapons expert Steve Starr and Schiller Institute founder Helga Sepp LaRouche to share their assessments of the global strategic situation so that the American people have an opportunity to consider the danger we are currently facing and how it might possibly be avoided. I do this because if our Congress were moral and courageous, these individuals would be addressing an emergency hearing to determine how to bring the war in Ukraine to a halt before we cross the threshold to the unthinkable thermonuclear war. If we are to avoid World War III and usher in a new era of peaceful relations among nations, the nation which must be brought to account is not Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, or even the Nazi-infested totalitarian regime in Ukraine. The nation whose actions can alleviate the current crisis and also change the world for generations to come is the United States. That is why I have announced my candidacy for U.S. Senate in 2024 and why I am asking all Americans, not only New Yorkers, to participate in this urgently needed symposium on January 8th. My guests are not participating for the purpose of endorsing my candidacy in an election which will occur after the crucial moment of decision, but to alert the American people to the very grave danger we face and your responsibility to address it. Now, I'll just say one thing, add one thing, which was discussed with me by Garland Nixon. Some of you know who that is. Appears on various podcasts and has his own show. And Garland Nixon was pointing out that the problem that you have entered into in the United States is that things that are illegal on paper have become legalized in practice. And the example of that he was describing was the Kennedy documents. That the documents were supposed to have been released 25 years after the passage of the relevant congressional action, which came largely as in response to the popular response to the Oliver Stone movie JFK back done in 1991. Then the law was passed the subsequent year. That when the moment came in 2017 that those documents were to have been released, and even although it had been promised that they would be released, in fact, they were withheld. They were suppressed. This then occurred again earlier this month when the Biden administration did the same thing. So now, here's the question. What happens when things that are illegal on paper become legal in practice? Well, for example, take the assassination of a president. According to Tucker Carlson's source, according to him, the source stated that the source believed, presuming it was a he, that the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, was involved in the assassination of the President of the United States. Now, no such admission has ever come from any institution of the United States, and in fact, what has been left in the popular mind is that the so-called lone assassin had also visited the Soviet Union and was in some fashion politically disaffected from the United States. And in fact, according to the source, nothing like that is true. In fact, according to what to quote the source on this, he said, "It's all fake. What we've been told is all fake." So this means that we're in a critical moment in America in which, as in the play Hamlet, where the ghost of Hamlet's father cries for justice, the ghost of the murdered president of the United States and of his murdered brother and of the murdered Martin Luther King and of the murdered Malcolm X and of the murdered Fred Hampton, all of them being political murders. The ghosts of these people cry for justice. And this is something which is not only the moral responsibility of every American citizen, it is impossible to restore the soul of the republic unless America and the American citizenry comes to terms with that. Now, the problem involved is that the kind of mobilization you would need to do of the American citizen would be similar to the mobilization that Franklin Roosevelt did of the American citizens during December 8th of 1941 in his address to the Congress, and subsequent actions that were taken as a result of his address. Tonight, this is the second part of a three-part discussion that Gerry Rose is leading of the principle underlying Helga's 10 principles for a new security and development architecture. But we're doing this so that we might fortify people in the United States to confront the fact that the enemy of the United States to be concerned with, and the enemy that can be overcome, is in the mirror. It's in the mirror of the American people. And it is not their government merely. It is their own relationship to self-government. What happens when the things that are illegal on paper become legalized in practice? What do you do? Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Gerry and let him take us where he will. Gerry? You may be muted. We're not hearing you.
Okay, fine. I unmuted myself.
Great.
Okay, so look, I just want to underscore the centrality of Helga's initiative on the 10 principles. When I first heard it, like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, when she presented it to a major forum, I was stunned. The reason being that she had been working on this question of a security and development architecture. She'd been thinking about it. She had been presenting it in different ways. But what she did in a succinct, absolutely clear way was to identify the principles of sovereignty and the nature of this oligarchism that had kept people in slavery and war, extremely succinct, the implications of the nuclear threat as making people world citizens, every person on the planet as a world citizen, the fundamental question of identity in terms of the discovery of truth, and raising the question of genius, as we discussed in some sense last week, and certainly the follow-up discussion focused on it, as the only reliable leaders in such a fight. And then finally, the principle of natural law, which the genius is subservient to. Now, people think of natural law in a certain way, and we're going to get into that in the third class. They think of it as a series of set laws, even speakable laws. But we're going to take up the question of creativity per se and the nature of the identity needed for creativity per se. And of course, she ends with the fundamental man is good. So it was extremely succinct. It was extremely concrete in a certain way, and it evoked in anybody who is willing to consider the full implications of what she said and the way she developed it, would be inspired to say, oh my God, that's it. That is the development and security architecture. And she had been working on this. We all know that. But then she was very succinct and in that sense beautiful. There was a quality of beauty in the thorough composition that she presented and the way she presented it to that meeting. And therefore, deliberations on this, and others I think should participate, and we should solicit that. Cliff Karakoff gave a discussion of it, others did. But so it was beautiful. I also think what Dennis has proposed on this Kennedy question and the way that we're going after it in terms of, at the 50th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination, we were the only ones in the country who performed at the crucial church in Massachusetts in which the requiem, in which he he was given a requiem speeches 50 years before. We were the only ones who did it. And the quality of performance, the quality of mind that came across of Kennedy himself in the interplay between the music and his sense of identity, which transcended anything that, as John Segerson said, on the one hand, you could say the music did something and Kennedy did something, but really by themselves it wouldn't have worked. But the two together and the way it was presented as a piece of thorough composition, because people are hungry for truth and beauty. They are hungry for it. There has been such a vast stretch from the death of the murder of Kennedy, except for Lynn and Helga. But in terms of the institutions of government, now Lynn was part of the institution of presidency. Dennis has gone through that many times. But in terms of the government itself, particularly since 2001, well, the famous 9/11. So this shines out. The combination of what Helga presented and this, as Dennis said very effectively, this question of the ghost of Hamlet. And we were discussing it this morning in one of the phone team talks, and it always stunned me when Hamlet found out about his father as a ghost stalking the castle. He says, "Oh, my prophetic soul." It's very important because prophetic, meaning I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. And as we develop this and present the Kennedy and what was behind it, and I'm going to go through some of it tonight, some of it, in a different way, people will say, "Oh, my prophetic soul." So I hope to evoke that insight. Now, how do we start? I'm going to do something different tonight because I've developed this question of Roosevelt as a stunning singularity. And I presented it actually on a Thursday talk that he was what is called a universal genius. And what he invented as a method of approach to government had never been done before. Never. Now, as we established last week, conclusively, is that the foundations of the first nation state, which was Louis XI's France, was based upon genius. And that the quality of genius of Joan of Arc and Louis XI and the cunning and ruthless capability of Louis XI, I'm not going to go through it again tonight, was capable of consolidating against the oligarchy of both France and England. He was capable of consolidating the first commonwealth committed to the general welfare of its population. There had been other good kings, and they had a certain amount of power and capability. But this was different because it was based upon an idea of man which issues from the Renaissance, as I think a number of people said. But it issues from the Renaissance. There is never an age where there are no human beings, because we're designed in such a way as to as an image of the Creator in not the creator, but the image of the creator, is what we call the mind or creativity per se, right? There's never a point where there is no one. And that's what I'm going to take up tonight. And it's stunning. But after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and this is from the book Roosevelt and Stalin, Portrait of a Partnership by Susan Butler. 6 months after Roosevelt died, as we know, the Bretton Woods system was designed to end colonial rule once and for all. I've done that a number of times. I'm going to do that again. Okay. 6 months after his death, Secretary Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, who was a conservative, proposed to Harry Truman that, and he worked out a proposal with a number of people to share all the nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. Now, he's a conservative, and he calls on Harry Truman to evoke a cabinet meeting with others involved to hash out this idea that we must share the nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. Of the 20 people, of the 18 men present, and I'm going to go through some of what they said. Of the 18 men present, 13 of them wanted to immediately share the nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. 3 were against, and 3 thought of the people who agreed that we could wait a little while. But 13 were convinced that we had to do this. Now, the first person who presented it was Vannevar Bush, the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. He was there to present the views of the Manhattan Project scientists. Vannevar Bush, said, "We are now we have no corner on knowledge or the efforts of physicists." He favored giving Russia everything we have as regards to the principles of atomic energy. Dean Acheson, Undersecretary of State, who was offered the view that the advantage of being ahead in such a race is nothing compared with not having a race at all. Conceive of a world in which we were the hoarders of military secrets from our allies, particularly this great ally. Now, this is Dean Acheson. So he's arguing we must avoid cutting off the Soviet Union from being allies with us. There were 3 who did not agree. The most important one was Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. This is what he said. The Russians, like the Japanese, are essentially Oriental in their thinking. And until we have a longer record or experience with them on validity of engagements, it seems doubtful that we should endeavor to buy their understanding and sympathy. We tried once with Hitler. Now, this becomes very important because Forrestal was the president of Dillon Reed, one of the biggest Wall Street firms in existence at the time. He served under Roosevelt, but the second Roosevelt died, Now, Abe Fortas, who was on the Supreme Court, said, if we protect the secret of the bomb, we will hinder industrial applications of atomic energy. It should be kept in mind that when the principles of atomic energy are used industrially, the secrets of the atomic bomb will not be kept any longer. So at that meeting, the majority decided to share nuclear technology and joint development so that Russia would remain our allies at the end of the war. Now, what happened? The day after the meeting, the New York Times presented an account of the meeting that bore little, if any, resemblance to what had taken place. And General Groves, who actually was the head of the Manhattan Project in terms of the administrator, in a widely reported speech that influenced a great many people because as an engineer in charge of the Manhattan Project, he was the authority figure. And he said the bomb should remain an American secret. Well, this becomes interesting a little later. The bizarre page 1 New York Times article was headlined, "Plea to give the Soviet atom secrets stirs debate in cabinet. No decision made on the Wallace plan." So they attributed the Stimson, who was a conservative Republican, who presented the plan to share all secrets with the Soviets. They presented it as the Wallace plan. Who everybody they had this left-wing profile of him. He really wasn't, but Wallace planned to share the bomb data as peace insurance. And then the Washington reporter, Felix Blair, it was probably Forrestal who fed him the false account of the meeting, because they report that not only did Wallace present it, but it was rejected, the exact opposite of what happened. But there was a brawl on this question, because this question of and she goes through it, Susan Butler goes through it. Stalin was prepared, even after Roosevelt died. If he had gotten the credits, if he had gotten a certain assurances, if he had been brought in on the dropping of the atom bomb, if he had been brought in on this discussion, then there's no question. Eisenhower was absolutely clear. There would be no question that there would not have been a Cold War. So that the issue, which later became under Eisenhower, Truman particularly, but this idea that the nuclear weapons and the Cold War, and this guy Paul Nietzsche, who was also from Dillon Reed, wrote a memo which is called NSC 69, which said that because of the Cold War, we can weaponize the CIA. We can do clandestine warfare. We can overthrow governments. And it's precisely this memo, this NSC 68, which was the basis to give the CIA wet works, illegal authority to overthrow governments. And the Mossadegh government was the first to fall on that. This was so abhorrent to Kennan, who had written that we would have to fight the Cold War, but we would have to create a strong economy, create a strong capability to fight it over time, not as an offensive military capability, which NHTSA of Dillon Reed had presented, and that Eisenhower, when he came in, the first thing he went after was this NSC 68, in which he brought to light, he said, we're going to debate this out. This is not going to happen. And he had a long discussion and debate and forced the intelligence community to back off that at the time when he was around. But that what Eisenhower did, remember he was the chief of staff of Roosevelt. He, after Marshall, he was the top military man. He proposed to stop the Cold War. We had to end Korea. And what Dean Andromedis points out is that most likely the Korean War was a reaction to the overthrow of and the use of the CIA to overthrow government under and take offensive action. And Dean is pretty strong on that, so that it provoked the Korean War, because then the Russians and the Chinese could no longer could not assume that everything was possible, including preemptive nuclear war. So that Eisenhower was going to go to Moscow and meet with Stalin, and the two of them would work out a joint proposal to end the Korean War and to work together on certain critical projects. And the big critical project that Eisenhower presented was called the Atoms for Peace program, in which the nuclear capabilities of both countries, of Russia and the United States, would be united for the peaceful use and development of nuclear energy worldwide. Now this, caused complete freakout. And unfortunately, Stalin died before the meeting. It was going to be a meeting between Eisenhower and Stalin. He didn't want anybody else there, and that they would have worked out the end of the Korean War and the development of nuclear energy. So that there was not, even though Roosevelt died and the enemy went ape under Truman, because of what Roosevelt did. And now let me tell you something. The head of the Atomic Energy Commission was Lilienthal, who was the head of the TVA. And Lilienthal, now this was before Eisenhower. This is under Truman. But Lilienthal told General Grove that there must be international development of nuclear energy. Remember, Lilienthal was in the center of the TVA and the spreading of the TVA worldwide. In fact, he was tapped after the TVA to go to work out a deal between India and Pakistan for the development of a TVA type on the Ganges-Brahmaputra River. So Lilienthal tells Grove, the militarists, the guys who wanted to use the nuclear weapons to threaten the world, he would barely speak to Grove. and he was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And therefore, Eisenhower proposed that Atoms for Peace was just stunning, absolutely stunning. And again, at the end of his, as we all know, at the end of his tenure as president after the second term, and there's a lot more to it. Dean has a series of about 6 or 7 articles on that interim and the groupings that were around Eisenhower, including the fact that Eisenhower had told Churchill that he should end colonial rule, that Churchill become a great man, the guy who ended the British Empire. He really did say this to him, and said, it's an anachronism, you have to give it up, and you would be hailed as one of the greatest men in history. But he totally meant it. But this was the Roosevelt perspective. Everyone knew what Roosevelt thought. There's a very interesting discussion in Butler's book about who opposed the dropping of the atom bomb, which of course Eisenhower did, MacArthur did, every major military figure did. Because on the one hand, MacArthur said it very plainly, you never use military to harm to innocent civilians and children. You never use military for that. That's terrorism. That's barbarism. And that's what he said when he was asked about the dropping of the nuclear weapons. This is terrorism. We've descended to barbarism. So he had no compunction on saying what he thought on that. But that the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about, they needed the Cold War. That was the way that they were playing their geopolitical game and weaponizing the CIA and justifying everything on the basis of the Cold War. So that this gets us to the core of the Kennedy question. Because I'm going to read you parts of his speech, the famous speech at American University, to give you a sense of the kind of bombshell, and maybe that's a bad mixed metaphor, but it was stunning if you understand the context. Remember, he had created, much as Eisenhower, certainly what Roosevelt had done with Stalin. He had created a back channel with Khrushchev, which saved us from nuclear holocaust. So his presentation at American University was stunning, and right in the face of Allen Dulles, and who he had to fire. He fired Allen Dulles because of the Bay of Pigs, the Dulles brothers. So here's what he says. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he said, "What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace because the new face of war, total war, makes no sense in an age where the great powers maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces, and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age where deadly poisons produced by nuclear exchange could be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Then he goes down. He says, first, examine our attitude toward peace. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it's unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable. Now, I'm just going to skip to give you a sense of the thing. He says, genuine peace must be a product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there are still quarrels, conflicting interests, like in a family. And then he goes on to say, peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goals more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people see it, to draw hope from it, and move irresistibly toward it. So now he says, second, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. He says, no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economics, in industrial growth, in culture, and in acts of courage. Among the many traits the people of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions lost their homes. Their families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of our country east of Chicago. Now, he proposes, and this was concrete, that America was, he wanted a joint test ban treaty. Khrushchev could not get it through on his own military. So he said, well, we will not test nuclear weapons above ground. And that he wanted a meeting between himself, Khrushchev, and Macmillan to work out a test ban treaty. So, I'm going to, how does he end? He says, the United States, as the world knows, and this is about himself anyway, will never start a war. We do not want war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it, but we shall also do our part to build a world peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. And he got killed for it. And that's the truth. It was in the wake of this speech, the end of the Cold War, the actual mission of the nation state was proposed. And he knew what he was dealing with. And they killed him. And the incredible, disgusting irony is that the head of the Warren Commission was Allen Dulles, probably the guy who plotted his assassination. So I just wanted to present an initial discussion.